तत्सवितुर् वरं रूपं ज्योतिः परस्य धीमहि यन्नः सत्येन दीपयेत्। ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः। Namaskar. My dear brothers and sisters, the topic of discussion today is a passage from a compilation of the Mother's works, The Great Adventure. And this passage occurs on page 363 of this compilation. The first two paragraphs of the passage on this page have been discussed earlier, but for sake of recapitulation, the first two paragraphs are about the principal reason behind the individuality that if we find in human beings. Compared to the rest of the creation on earth, we find that human beings have a distinctly better intellect, and it is this highly developed intellect that has made it possible for human beings to have distinct ideas, opinions, desires, ambitions, goals in life, and the result is that each individual is distinct, and this is something which occurs only in human beings. We can sort of say that if all creation is a play of the divine, and all that happened on earth before the advent of man, if that was Leela 1.0, human being is Leela 2.0. Now, why this individuality was the question that was put to the mother, and she said that this difference between individuals makes it possible for human beings to have their distinct goals and aspirations in life. And what is significant, therefore, is that some individuals, instead of using the free will that they have, will aspire for evolving spiritually, for growing in consciousness. And in fact, the entire evolution so far has been about evolution of consciousness. So in other words, if human beings aspire for it, they'll be different from all the other creatures that came before, in the sense that instead of living their life as constituted by nature, primarily to take care of their survival as individuals and as a species, human beings, at least some human beings, will aspire to evolve and evolve in consciousness, that is. And the result will be that these human beings will, unlike all the creatures earlier, instead of letting nature work out further evolution of consciousness, these individuals will collaborate with nature in the evolution of consciousness. So that is the purpose behind this individuality, and the human beings have this free will, and they don't take care only of the preservation of the individual and the species. That is how this intellect that gives the human beings the free will and the aspiration is used for sometimes for things which may not work in the interest of the individual and the species. They think of the larger interests of not only the human being, but of all creation, of the environment, and so on and so forth. Or say, for example, a human being may use his free will not to find food, but deliberately to go on a fast unto death for a cause. So the individual is not working for the preservation of the individual, but for something different, because the goal is somewhat higher, goal is distinctly higher. And in the same way, the individual may not always work for preservation of the species. An individual may decide not to get married throughout her life because she feels that that is the way she can evolve better spiritually. So the human species is distinct, and this individuality makes it possible for some individuals to aspire for evolving spiritually, and that seems to be the principal reason from the evolutionary standpoint why this individuality has been given to human beings. Now let's assume that we have an individual now who is one of those who has a distinct aspiration to grow in consciousness. What is the highest aspiration that such an individual can have? And that we can say in light of one of the mother's prayers in prayers and meditations. The mother says that let my aspiration be to know thee and to serve thee better. To know the divine and to serve the divine better than I am doing now. And that would mean in the best possible way. That should be the aspiration. And how can that be fulfilled? Again, taking a cue from one of the mother's utterances. Oh God, let me do in the best way I can the best thing to do. Golden words, just mark them carefully. Let me do in the best way I can, not in the best way possible. Because that may not be possible for me. I have limitations, but at least I should do in the best way I can. The important thing is, what is it that I should do in the best way I can? The best thing to do. And how do I know what the best thing to do is? For that, I have my inner guide, the psychic being, the dynamic aspect of the soul, which tells me in no uncertain terms, very clearly and very quickly, what the right thing to do is in a particular situation. So that is how I know what the best thing to do is. So with this background, which is based on the first two paragraphs, let's read what is there in the next two paragraphs on page 363 of The Great Adventure. The mother says, and it is the only thing valid in every case, when you want to do a thing, when you cannot do a thing, when you move, when the body is no more able to move. In every case, that only that. To come in conscious contact with the Supreme Consciousness, to be united with it, and to wait there. It is then that you receive the exact indication of what you ought to do at each minute, to do or not to do, to act or to be stone still. That is all. Let's go over it slowly. And it is the only thing valid in every case. When you want to do a thing, when you cannot do a thing, when you move, when the body is no more able to move. So a human being has a free will. He wants to do something, and sometimes he cannot do it. To the extent that he cannot even move, he wants to move, and the body is unable to move. Now, when does that happen? That happens when what we are trying to do is not consistent with our highest aspiration. It is not consistent with what our inner guide, the psychic being, is trying to tell us. And the psychic being, in fact, is not just a guide, it is also coupled to a reward and punishment system. The reward of paying heed to the voice of the psychic being is joy, and even more important, lasting mental peace. And on the other hand, the punishment, the inbuilt punishment for not doing what it is trying to tell us, in other words, the punishment for not doing the right thing is a sense of guilt, and even more important, recurrent uneasiness, which may sometimes go on for years, sometimes for a lifetime. So that is the reward and punishment system to which it is with which the psychic being is associated. And that is how the person knows. Not only that, we find that the muscles also sort of seem to protest. If a person is trying to do something which is not in keeping with the voice of the psychic being, the muscles protest, the muscles go limp. Now this is something which now has grown into the science of kinesiology. Don't get frightened by the high-sounding term. You can relate it to your own experience. You might have seen very often that when you have decided to do something right, something good, something which goes beyond the considerations of your own little self, it is beyond any considerations of material gain or loss, something which is based on universal and unconditional love, you find that not only you feel happy, you get a sense of joy in anticipation of what you will do, you get also charged with a lot of vitality and enthusiasm. But along with that, you also feel as if the muscles are speaking in their own way. And what is the way the muscles speak? By showing a great willingness, eagerness to contract, to work. So you suddenly feel strong. You feel that you have a lot of boundless energy, energy which you can't imagine you ever had, and sort of you are supercharged at every level. The mind has that joy and vitality and enthusiasm. The intellect develops a very strong will to overcome all obstacles and to go as fast as possible. And the muscles also acquire a new strength and they feel strong. On the other hand, if maybe due to a worldly gain or loss, you decide to do something which in the heart of hearts you know is not the right thing to do, not only you feel uneasy within, which means that not only the mind feels uneasy, the body also sort of protests. The limbs go limp. You feel as if you're all drained, there's not enough energy left, as if the muscles are also telling us we don't want to do it, and the body doesn't move. Now this has something which developed into the science of kinesiology. Kinesis means movement. So kinesiology is the science of movement. It developed in the second half of the 20th century, and some of the principal contributors were a physiotherapist, Dr. Goodhart, and then a psychiatrist, Dr. Diamond, and then another psychiatrist, Dr. David Hawkins. So this physiotherapist found that if you give a person something which is healthy, say a healthy food supplement, then the muscles grow strong. If on the other hand, you give this person, say, an artificial sweetener, the muscles become weaker. It is as if the genuineness of something physical somehow gets communicated in some mysterious way to the body, and that shows up in the strength or the weakness of the muscles. This work was further extended by a psychiatrist, Dr. Diamond, and he found that this applies not only to physical objects but also to thoughts and feelings. Positive thoughts and feelings make the muscles stronger, and negative ones make the muscles weaker. And then stepped in another psychiatrist, Dr. David Hawkins, who found that not only the muscles become stronger or weaker under these situations, one can also calibrate the extent to which they grow strong or weak, and this can be linked to the consciousness of a person, a spiritual teacher, of a book or a philosophy. So when exposed to any of these influences, the muscles not only grow stronger with something positive and weaker with something negative, even the degree of positivity can be calibrated, and he did it for a large number of activities for the human race as a whole, for many human beings, for many books and philosophies and so on. And he did all this calibration on a scale of 1 to 1000, which is a logarithmic scale, which means a highly condensed scale. A small difference can correspond to a big difference in consciousness. But anyway, we'll not go into that. But if you are interested, then this person ended up writing a very powerful book called Force versus Power, an Anatomy of Consciousness. In other words, the type of action that we decide to do using our free will has an effect on all parts of the being. So our deepest self, the psychic being, when we pay heed to it, we find that the mind, the intellect, and the body itself responds positively. It gets charged with a tremendous amount of energy and capability to translate that into action. And on the other hand, if for any reason, for any compulsion, which we may call a compulsion, we decide to do something which is not right, then we feel that even our body does not cooperate fully. So let's look at this passage again. You find that when you want to do a thing, when you cannot do a thing, you want to do it, but you cannot do it because it is not the right thing to do. It is not in keeping with our highest aspirations. It is not consistent with, it is ignoring the guidance coming from the divine within. When you move, when the body is no longer able to move. So, even the movement seems to become difficult, if not impossible. In every case, that only that, to come in conscious contact with the Supreme Consciousness. So what is required in these situations is to contact the Supreme Consciousness, the Divine, a representative of which, a spokesperson of which resides within us as the psychic being, make a conscious contact with the Divine within and be united with it, which means unite the surface, the body and the mind with it, and one finds that the energy comes and one is able to do it. Then the mother goes on to say, it is then that you receive the exact indication of what you ought to do at each minute, to do or not to do, to act or to be stone still. When we make a conscious contact with the divine within, we know what to do and what not to do. It is not only about doing the right thing, but sometimes it is about not doing something, which can also be the voice of the divine. Not only not doing something very obvious like having a negative thought about somebody or doing a dishonest act, but even not trying to work hard to fulfill a desire. That itself can also be a voice of the psychic being. Overcoming a desire, therefore, is quite often consistent with the voice of the psychic being and gives us tremendous amount of joy. In fact, overcoming a desire gives us a greater joy than fulfilling it. One can say that's almost hardly any worldly desire which, when fulfilled, after a very short time does not leave some sort of a bitter aftertaste. And true joy and lasting mental peace comes, in fact, from overcoming desires rather than fulfilling them. So when we decide to do something which is in keeping with our highest aspiration, something which is a compassionate act or generosity or anything which arises from love. Basically, these are all expressions of love, whether it is gratitude or generosity or compassion. These are all different forms of giving what we have to somebody who needs it. When we decide to do any such thing, we find that in anticipation itself we get a tremendous amount of joy. We can see that having done that, we'll have no regrets. We will have no reason to feel uneasy. We'll get lasting mental peace. And then we find that we are charged with that vitality, with enthusiasm. The body feels strong. Not only that happens, we find that the external circumstances also start changing. Because after all, our body and mind are an expression of the same Supreme Consciousness of which all our circumstances are. We find that when we decide to do the right thing, the circumstances also start changing. Help comes along from somewhere. Hurdles and obstacles start getting cleared. And it is as if the universe conspires to help us fulfill this aspiration. I think the best way to conclude would be the first few lines from this very powerful book by Sri Aurobindo, The Mother, a small booklet, but very powerful booklet. Right on the first page, in the first paragraph, Sri Aurobindo says, there are two powers that alone can effect in their conjunction the great and difficult thing which is the aim of our endeavor, a fixed and unfailing aspiration that calls from below, and a supreme grace from above that answers. Now, what is the aim of our endeavor? To unite with the divine. That is the aim of yoga. And there are two powers alone that can help us, that can work it out, that can work out this union. A fixed and unfailing aspiration. An aspiration which is intense and sincere, fixed and unfailing, unshakable, intense but not impatient. That type of an aspiration which is a call from below. But then also is required the answer from above, supreme grace. But the supreme grace, Aurobindo goes on to say, will act only in the conditions of the light and the truth. It will not act in conditions laid upon it by the falsehood and the ignorance, which means that this grace, which is indispensable for completing this union, for fulfilling our aspiration, will not work if what we have decided to do is not in keeping with our highest aspiration. It is not consistent with the guide within, the soul, the psychic being. And therefore, what is important is that to achieve this combination of our aspiration and grace, what we do should also be consistent with this highest aspiration. That is what provides the foundation, the conditions of light and truth. Because that is the supreme illumination which we have within. As Aurobindo says that the light from the divine within is like a sky flare. It lights up all the ground. In contrast with the mind, which is like a torchlight which can light up only a few feet at a time, the psychic being has a wide vision, the big picture. It lights up the whole ground like a sky flare and does it very quickly. In a second, it can accomplish what the laborious process of reason cannot in hours. And with this guide that we have available within and this understanding, it should not be really difficult for us to understand why and how in some situations when we want to do something, not only we are supercharged, the circumstances change and it becomes so easy. And why in some other situations, when we want to do something, it becomes difficult. Even the muscles start protesting, they don't seem to move. Thank you.